From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. The announcement, when it came, was a sombre one. A cardinal, flanked by 3 others, all dressed in black, lined up to tell the world the Pope was dead.
Carissimi fratelli e sorelle, con profondo dolore devo annunciare la morte del nostro Santo Padre Francesco.
At the age of 88, after 12 years at the head of the Catholic Church, Pope Francis died early on Monday morning, just hours after his last public appearance, as he delighted the crowds of thousands who'd gathered in St. Peter's Square on Easter Sunday.
It was an Easter surprise many people had been hoping for. Pope Francis appeared in St. Peter's Square right after Easter Mass. He blessed the crowds, he wished everyone a happy Easter, and he even jumped on the Pope Mobile to tour St. Peter's Square to greet the ecstatic crowd.
Looking visibly frail, the Pope delivered his Easter blessing from his wheelchair on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica.
Cari fratelli e sorelle, buona Pasqua. Il maestro delle cerimonie di leggere il messaggio. Benedicatus omnipotens Deus, Pater et Filius et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
Despite months of serious illness and hospitalization, the Pope even managed a private meeting with the American Vice President, J.D. Vance, on Easter Sunday, just before he appeared on the balcony.
Meeting comes amid tensions between the Catholic Church and the Trump administration. The Pope previously criticized the White House over its immigration policies and cuts to U.S. aid.
So good to see you. I know you've not been feeling great, but it's good to see you in better health.
Grazie.
A champion for the poor and the weak, Pope Francis was never one to shy away from criticising governments. He took on the Trump administration's immigration policies, the bombing of Gaza and the invasion of Ukraine. Perhaps it's a mark of the man that his death led to glowing tributes from across the world, including those he criticised, from all sides in the Middle East, the Trump administration, and even Vladimir Putin, who described him as an outstanding person. As a period of mourning begins, in the Vatican, the process to choose his successor will also be underway.
A conclave is the ultimate election.
Cardinals from across the world will be shut inside the Sistine Chapel to take part in a secret vote. The system, still shrouded in mystery, was dramatised in last year's award-winning film Conclave, and rumours about the intrigue behind the scenes have never gone away.
The Vatican has always been a kind of notorious hotbed for gossip and backstabbing. All the skullduggery, all the jealousies, all the enmities, all the resentments.
So what happens next? And why does the fight to become the next head of the Catholic Church have consequences far beyond the congregation? The story today, how the Papal Conclave works.
I am Tom Kington. I'm the Rome correspondent for The Times.
And Tom, before we get into how a conclave works and what happens next, for anyone who hasn't been, just tell us a bit about the Vatican, the setting for all of this.
Okay, so people will be familiar with St. Peter's Square, which is the big square outside the Basilica. It's surrounded by the Bernini colonnades, and it's where people gather on Sundays and on Wednesdays to hear what the Pope has to say. People will also know the Sistine Chapel with the fabulous frescoes by Michelangelo. Between the Sistine Chapel and St. Peter's Basilica, there's Vatican City itself, walled off, tiny statelet, which is not usually accessible to the public. It's got rather nicely tended gardens. It's got the small building where Pope Benedict used to live after he retired. And it has a department store where you can get good stuff at very good prices.
How surprisingly prosaic. It also has possibly the coolest guards.
That's right, yeah. So the Swiss guards who clank around in their pantaloons and with their spears and shoo you off if you're a tourist trying to get through the gates that enter into the Vatican City. I expect we'll see a lot of them in coming days as they need to step up and make sure that the Vatican is secure.
Tom, you've lived in Rome through Pope Francis's papacy, which started in 2013. How do you think his tenure will be remembered?
Well, he described himself as the Pope from the peripheries. So he was the first Pope from the Southern Hemisphere, from the Americas, the first Pope from outside Europe since the 8th century. And he played that up. He was the Pope who was there to represent the little guy. And it really worked insofar as he would travel and draw enormous crowds. So in 2015, there were about 6 million people who showed up to a mass in Manila, 1 million in Kinshasa in 2023.
Jetting in from Papua New Guinea, Pope Francis arrived to a small nation, putting on a big welcome.
And in 2024, about half the population of East Timor turned out to see him when he showed up there.
The church is as influential as ever these days in Timor. It feels like everybody here is trying to see the Pope.
This was definitely a big change from the papacy of his predecessor, Pope Benedict, who was a rather sort of bookish theologian who was happy to talk about the kind of rigid doctrine. Pope Benedict was someone who felt that it was time to sort of set down the rules, not allow any kind of dissolving of the faith, no happy clappy stuff, no guitar playing in church, hardcore. And Pope Francis, by contrast, was what us journalists tend to call, in shorthand, mercy before dogma Pope, someone who was willing to sort of bend the rules slightly, but at the same time ensure that the Catholic community was being well looked after and sinners were being forgiven and migrants and the poor were being brought in to the flock.
And he was quite liberal in some of his attitudes.
Absolutely. So one of his most famous statements was, "Who am I to judge?"
If a person is gay and seeks God and has goodwill, who am I to judge him?
He also engineered a bit of wiggle room in the rules to allow Catholics who marry and then divorce and then try and remarry to receive communion, something that they were then denied.
And he was unusual in wading into political matters at times too.
Certainly, I think that his opponents thought that he was more of a politician than a religious leader. So particularly on things like climate change, where he had no hesitation in lashing out at polluters.
Lamentablemente, Unfortunately, we have gotten to a point of no return. It's sad, but that's what it is. Climate change at this moment is a road to death.
And also when it came to war, he was very vociferous in his condemnation of arms producers. He thought that arms traders, arms dealers, arms manufacturers were the font of all evil and didn't hesitate to say so.
Why are deadly weapons being sold to those who plan to inflict untold suffering on individuals and society? Sadly, the answer, as we all know, is simply for money. Money that is drenched in blood, often innocent blood.
For his successor, whoever that might be, what sort of challenges do they now face?
Well, given everything I've just said, Pope Francis has left the Catholic Church quite sharply divided. There's quite a hard core of conservative Catholics who sort of yearning for another pope like Pope Benedict, someone who can put doctrine right back at the heart of Catholicism. On the other hand, you've got quite a lot of Catholics, bishops in Germany, who are pushing in the other direction, who are actually a little bit further to the left than Francis. So I think that the challenge that his successor now faces is to bring all those contrasting elements back together, try and reunify the Catholic Church.
And Tom, we won't find out who his successor is until after a papal conclave. Just stepping back, how ancient is the practice of a papal conclave?
I think it goes back to the 13th century. I think the first one was in 1276. It's a tried and tested method, therefore, that's been running kind of smoothly ever since, based on the idea that the cardinals are all put in a room and locked away until they come to a decision. The word conclave literally means with key, referring to the key that is used to lock them in. I covered the previous conclave back in 2013 when it was running at the same time as a really long and exhausting government crisis in Italy. So 10 minutes down the road from the Vatican, where the cardinals were just wrapping things up pretty quickly, pretty smoothly, Italian politicians were completely unable to get a government together. And you could feel this sort of slightly smug air over the Vatican as cardinals were thinking, well, you know, we've taken care of business. What about you?
It does seem to be remarkably smooth, given that it is also the oldest historical method of electing a head of state and still in use now, as you say, since 1275. Where exactly does it take place? You mentioned the Sistine Chapel. Let me just describe the splendour in which people are voting.
The Sistine Chapel, it's the showroom. It's the place where you get to see the splendour, the magnificence of Catholicism, thanks to those frescoes by Michelangelo, which lay out the whole story of Christianity. So you'll have your dozens of cardinals sat there thinking, okay, if the Holy Spirit will seep through us and fuel our decision-making at this point, there's no better place to do it.
It is a remarkable moment. There's nothing quite like it. The Vatican as a state is obviously tiny, but how big at the moment is the Catholic Church? You know, when they do find a new pope, how much of the world are they basically representing?
I think it's 1 billion Catholics, more or less. It's quite a constituency spread right around the world. We'll have our 138 voting cardinals coming from around the world to represent them. And really, they will represent them, because one of the effects of the Francis papacy was that a lot of cardinals were appointed in far-flung places, Mongolia, for example.
So this will be a conclave unlike any other. People arriving from all sorts of far-flung places. Just describe What happens?
When the cardinals are in Rome, before the conclave happens, they will attend what's known as general congregations. The general congregations are meetings at which the cardinals will get together and stand up, make speeches about the kind of church that they want to see. So they will be used as sort of stump speeches by possible candidates. Other cardinals will just get up and they won't have any interest in becoming pope because they're not well known enough, but they'll want to sort of put down a marker and say, whoever wins, this is what we want to happen. Now, those general congregations will bring together the cardinal electors, who are cardinals who are under 80, but also cardinals who are over 80, who can kind of muck in, have their say, the sort of wise old heads.
But they don't get a vote.
But they will not be going into the Sistine Chapel to vote.
How does that process work? I mean, when you have the people who don't get a vote but are still sort of taking part, is it all quite smooth running?
Sometimes not. There have been suspicions in the past that the cardinals who are over 80, because they feel a little bit disengaged, that they're sometimes up for feeding friendly journalists tidbits from these meetings. So you get a lot of fuss when stuff pops up in the Italian press saying, okay, this is what they talked about yesterday, and everyone's looking around saying, who on earth rang Il Messaggero or La Repubblica or whoever. And there is quite a stress on secrecy. At the last conclave, the American contingent of cardinals said that in the interests of transparency, they were going to have daily briefings for the press. And they were quickly slapped down by the Vatican and told that they couldn't do it and had to stop that immediately because the Vatican had different ideas on transparency.
So it's a democracy, but not a very open one. How does the voting system actually work?
On the first day of the conclave, the cardinals will be led into the Sistine Chapel. An order is given called extra omnes, which means that everyone except those cardinals must leave. So the voting can begin with one round of voting on the first afternoon, followed by 4 on successive days, 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. In order to vote, cardinals need to write the name of their candidate in disguised handwriting on a card.
Disguised handwriting?
That's right, yes.
Why?
Perhaps using capital letters or, writing left-handed. I suppose just so that anonymity is guaranteed. That card is then folded in half and the cardinals walk up and slide it into a large chalice, which is on a desk at the end of the room. A scrutineer selected from their ranks will extract the cards, read out the name, notes down the name one by one, before another cardinal then passes a thread and needle through each ballot to link them.
And how many votes does a cardinal generally need to win?
You need 2/3. As it stands, that's 90-odd votes to win. That's the rule in the first 3 days. Now, if there's no winner by that time, there's a 1-day pause whilst prayers are held so that minds can be focused and a bit more channeling of the Holy Spirit can go on. And then it's back to voting. And if there's no result after 12 days, a simple majority is enough to win.
Now, I remember live running coverage of this, and everybody was watching for a sign that a decision had been made. Just remind us of how that actually happens.
Well, it's the smoke, isn't it? It's the chimney, it's the black smoke, the white smoke. So if there is no result after 2 rounds of voting in the morning or in the afternoon, you get the black smoke, and everyone in St. Peter's Square groans and goes home for tea. However, if there is a winner, the moment that happens, it's the white smoke out of the chimney.
Tom, you've taken us through the process of choosing a new pope, of what a papal conclave is like. A lot of that has been dramatised in the film Conclave.
The Pope is dead. The throne is vacant.
Have you seen it?
Yes, I've seen Conclave. I thought it was great. Some of the plot twists were perhaps a little bit too much. But one thing that occurred to me is that if the film had wanted to dwell even more on the real horse trading and the real intrigue during this whole process, perhaps it could have spent more time looking at the general congregations, which we've discussed, because that's, I think, where all the shenanigans go on, where people are sort of picking sides, choosing winners. Winners are setting out their stalls and being discredited immediately. You hear reports during the general congregations of gangs of cardinals going out to dinner in the streets around the Vatican, being followed to see who they're dining with. So it's real cloak and dagger stuff.
So much intrigue.
Absolutely.
You interviewed Robert Harris, the author of the book that the film is based on, last year. Why was he so drawn to the subject?
He said that a conclave is the ultimate election. And for someone who's always been fascinated by politics, that was the draw. He said that the idea that there is no electoral politicking at all at a conclave is complete nonsense. And he said something which bears repeating. He said that you can never tell who'll come out on top. And the fact that it's supposedly guided by the Holy Spirit and all the candidates disclaim any desire to win adds to the drama, because no one is ever saying what is actually on their mind.
And Tom, just explain why that is. Why is it that people aren't openly campaigning as they would in any other political election?
Well, there's a common expression used, which is that anyone who enters a conclave as a pope emerges as a cardinal. The point being that all the favourites tend to burn out very, very quickly. Any kind of superstar cardinals who go in and everyone's saying, okay, that's the guy, they'll always fade away. And often you get someone coming up from the rear to take it. So that's clearly why no one wants to fly the flag, as it were, before the conclave.
Let's just get into the drama of the next few days. Who are the different factions who'll be vying for power, who'll want different candidates they'll be pushing?
So it's just like politics in the rest of the world. It's your liberals against conservatives. If we look at the conservatives, there are quite a few coming from America. Then we have a block of Africans who have not taken kindly to Pope Francis's outreach to homosexuals.
Interesting. And the people who get a vote are the cardinals, 138 of them. How many of them were appointed by Pope Francis? And does that give us a sense of which way they might be voting? Are they more likely to be liberal because he was?
Well, if every cardinal appointed by Pope Francis now votes for a Francis-like candidate, then yes, the liberals will win, because I think about 110 of the 138 cardinals were appointed by Francis.
Wow.
However, that's not a given, because some of those cardinals are actually themselves conservative, despite the fact that Francis gave them the nod. And it's worth looking back to previous conclaves. There were a number of cardinals appointed by Pope Benedict and by Pope John Paul II, both of them conservatives, who went on to vote for Francis. So it's just not a given.
In the film Conclave, there's obviously a lot of plotting and backstabbing.
How has this been kept a secret for so long?
We'll never find a candidate who doesn't have any kind of black mark against them.
Although we sisters are supposed to be...
How realistic is that?
The Vatican has always been a kind of notorious hotbed for gossip and backstabbing. Pope Francis, when he gave an account once of the secret workings of a conclave, revealed that 40 cardinals had backed him in an early ballot in 2005 in a bid to block the election of Joseph Ratzinger, who was then subsequently elected Pope Benedict. And Francis said that he realized that he was being sort of sized up as an anti-Benedict candidate when a Spanish cardinal came up to him and asked if he was missing a lung.
Missing a lung?
Missing a lung. When he was a young priest, Francis had part of a lung removed after an infection. So clearly, the cardinals who were thinking that they could build him up as a candidate suddenly realized that he might be about to die and wouldn't be much use to them. Hence this question, this surprise question, how are your lungs? Francis said that he refused to accept the support from those cardinals, claiming that he would be voting for Benedict, who then, of course, won. So this was a very interesting story of how cardinals will decide on a candidate in a hurry to sort of use as a weapon against another candidate.
And just how dirty does the politics get? I mean, what sort of tactics do they use to try and persuade people to vote in a particular way?
One of the favorite tactics of people in the Vatican is the use of dossiers. So if you want to discredit someone, you'll put together a list, a CV with all the bad stuff on it, which will be circulated anonymously. And so you show up one morning during the conclave and there in your cubbyhole, there'll be an envelope with a piece of paper on it saying these are all the reasons why we shouldn't be voting for X or Y.
How bad does the bad stuff get?
I think money is probably the main weapon used against enemies. The idea that someone is living a little bit too luxuriously, they're dressing a little bit too much finery, their apartment is slightly too large. Those are the kind of things which would be possibly leveled against someone who you didn't want to be elected. Beyond that, you're getting into the realms of sort of sexual scandal, but money and sort of living in luxury is the main thing that is used against people.
And given that there is all of this sort of horse trading going on and all of the rumours and the campaigns and the secret sort of politicking, how much changes during the course of the conclave? I mean, can one standout speech change the outcome, or can one of these sort of campaigns of passing around a dossier make all the difference?
In 2013, the African Cardinal Robert Serra went into the conclave as a very strong contender. However, he saw his chances fade, possibly for that very reason, that he'd gone in as such a strong contender. Meanwhile, very few people, I think, had George Bergoglio, who became Pope Francis, on their list. And in fact, I was in St. Peter's Square when he was announced as the new Pope. He came out and everyone around me in the square was saying, who?
Really?
You saw everyone getting out their phones to Google him because no one really knew anything about him.
And Tom, this is the oldest voting system in the world that still continues. It's always been done like this, but when you understand the politics and the plotting and the betrayal that goes on sometimes in a conclave, does it in any way undermine the sanctity of the Pope's role?
One answer to that is that, yes, there's all the skullduggery, all the jealousies, all the enmities, all the resentments. But you could argue also that God's will is actually working there in the background. So whatever is happening in the foreground, the theatrics, whatever, at the end of the day, God's will kind of seep into the proceedings, and we will get a pope who will do the job correctly and work in the interests of the Catholic Church.
And just finally, for the 1 billion Catholics around the world, this is obviously a really profound moment, and whoever the new Pope is will make a huge difference to the way they view the world. Why should people who aren't Catholic be interested in this process?
As we've seen from the papacy of Pope Francis, one should take an interest in who the Pope is, given the role that Francis himself had in opposing war and fighting climate change, dealing with things that we're talking about. And what's been interesting to me is talking to people in Rome, just people on the street in Rome, about why they liked Pope Francis. Often the response was, he's the only guy out there saying war is bad. So, and these people weren't necessarily hardcore Catholics. They were just people who watched the news, and they were saying, we feel a little less protected now that he's gone.
That was Tom Kington, the Times correspondent in Rome, and you can read all of Tom's coverage of Pope Francis and the Conclave at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producer today was Sam Chantarasak, the executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you'd like to get in touch with us about anything you've heard today or on any other episode, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.